This is a $2 pistol. It's stamped out of flat steel. It holds exactly one bullet, and by every normal measure of what makes a gun good, it fails. Short range, no accuracy worth mentioning, one shot and it's empty forever. And in the summer of 1942, the United States built 1 million of them. On purpose, not despite how bad it was, but because of it. Here's the fear the pistol was built to spread the moment it reached occupied ground. A German soldier walks his curfew patrol through a village in France, and he keeps his back to the wall the whole way. Not because of snipers. The resistance barely has rifles, let alone marksmen. He hugs the wall because of a rumor that somewhere behind one of these dark windows, in a coat pocket or taped under a floorboard, there might be a pistol built to fire exactly once. And once is all it needs. That fear was the entire product. The United States didn't build a weapon that summer. It built a rumor with a trigger, and mass-produced that rumor 1 million times over. The problem it was solving had nothing to do with better weapons. In the spring of 1942, the war had a math problem nobody could fix by sending more rifles. Occupied Europe alone held tens of millions of people angry enough to fight and utterly unarmed. Airlifting real weapons to them was slow, loud, and required training nobody had time to give. So the Army's Joint Psychological Warfare Committee handed its engineers a brief that read, less like a weapons order and more like a riddle. Design something lethal enough to kill a man, cheap enough to make by the million, and simple enough that a person who'd never held a gun, who might not even read the language it came with, could pick it up and use it correctly on the first try. Read that requirement again. Not easy to use. Usable with 0 training, 0 literacy, and exactly 1 chance to get it right. Because there would be no second attempt, and no one nearby to explain it. That single sentence is what actually built this gun. Every decision that followed existed to serve it. If you're into history where the object itself is the main character, not the general, not the battle, the thing sitting in someone's hand, this is exactly the kind of story this channel is built around. Go ahead and subscribe now, because we're about to get to the part where this pistol gets genuinely strange. The engineers solved the no words problem with a wordless comic strip. A handful of pictures showing load, aim, fire, in an order a child could follow. That was the easy half. The harder problem was hiding that the thing existed at all. And this is where the name comes in. The one we haven't told you yet, because officially this pistol didn't have one. On paper, at General Motors, on every shipping manifest, it carried the designation Flare Projector Caliber .45, a flare gun, nothing more. Nothing worth an enemy agent's second glance. The engineering drawings went further. The barrel was labeled tube. The trigger was labeled yoke. The firing pin was called a control rod. The trigger guard was a spanner. An entire assassination tool was disguised, line by line, as a boring parts list, so that even a spy standing over the blueprints on a factory floor would see nothing worth reporting. Because here's the part almost nobody says out loud. This thing was never designed to win a fight. It couldn't. It held 1 round. Its range was about 25 feet, closer to a knife fight than a gunfight. If you actually tried to fight an occupying army with it, you'd lose. That was never the job. The job was one single act, repeated 1 million times over. Get close enough to one occupying soldier, use the one shot you have, and take the real weapon off his body. The gun's entire purpose was to end its own existence the moment it worked, to convert itself into something better. It wasn't a weapon. It was a down payment on one. Which leaves exactly one question worth asking. How do you build something meant to kill a man, cheap enough to hand to 1 million strangers, and hide it in plain sight from an entire continent under occupation? The answer starts on a General Motors assembly line that had never built a gun in its life, and it's about to move faster than anyone in that factory expected. The first version of this gun didn't look like a gun at all. It looked like a toy harmonica, a flat steel bar with two side-by-side chambers, each one holding a cartridge in place, with nothing but a thin strip of spring steel. Slide it, fire, slide it again. It was clever. It was also completely wrong for the job, and the man who designed it, George Hyde, knew it the moment he looked at the brief again. Two moving chambers meant two things that could jam, two things that could be built wrong on a rushed production line, two things standing between a stranger shaking hands and a shot that actually fires. The requirement wasn't clever. It was impossible to get wrong. So Hyde tore out half the gun. One chamber, one shot. No moving parts to speak of at all. What was left barely qualifies as a firearm in the traditional sense. 23 parts total. A barrel that isn't even rifled. Just a smooth 4-inch steel tube, because cutting spiral grooves into 1,000,000 barrels takes machining time nobody has. And at a killing range of 25 feet, spin-stabilized accuracy is a luxury this weapon was never going to need. There's no extractor mechanism to pull the spent casing out after firing. That's an entire moving system, and moving systems fail. Instead, the box includes a plain wooden dowel. You push it down the barrel and punch the empty shell out by hand, like clearing a stopped-up pipe. It is, by any real standard, a bad gun. It is also, by the only standard that mattered, exactly correct, because every part they removed was one less way for it to fail in the hands of someone who'd never fired a weapon before in their life. The body around that barrel isn't machined steel either. It's stamped, sheet metal punched into shape by a press, the same basic process that turns a flat plate into a car door or a headlight housing in one strike. No lathes, no precision tooling, no skilled machinists spending an hour per unit. Just steel going in one end of a press and a gun frame coming out the other. Which raises the obvious question: who builds a gun like that? And the answer is almost the whole joke of this entire program. Nobody who'd ever built a gun before. The design came out of General Motors' Inland Division, the same people already buried under wartime contracts for the M1 carbine, one of the most produced American small arms of the entire war. Inland had no spare capacity and no interest in adding a second firearms program on top of the one already stretching them thin. So the Army looked across the hall to Inland's sister division, Guidelamp, in Anderson, Indiana, a company that, in peacetime, made headlights and turned signals for automobiles. Guidelamp had never assembled a firearm, not one. What it had instead was exactly the machinery this project actually needed. Industrial stamping presses built to punch out thousands of identical sheet metal parts a day, fast, cheap, and dead consistent. The Army wasn't hiring gunsmiths. It was hiring an assembly line that happened to be sitting idle in the wrong industry. 300 workers took the job. And what happened next inside that Indiana plant is the part of this story that sounds made up even though every number is on record. Over an 11-week stretch, June to August of 1942, those 300 people assembled roughly 1 million of these pistols. Do the arithmetic on that, and it comes out to one finished, functional gun rolling off the line every 6.6 seconds, day and night, for nearly 3 straight months, out of a factory that 6 months earlier had been making parts for a car's dashboard. Put another way, a brand new pistol left that line faster than a trained shooter could load and fire the one already sitting in his hand. There's a strange kind of vertigo in that number. A factory with zero firearms experience, using no skilled gunsmiths, producing military hardware faster than most trained arsenals of the era could manage, because the entire design had been built, from the very first sketch, to be assembled fast rather than assembled well. Every constraint that made this a bad gun, no rifling, no extractor, stamped steel instead of machined parts, was the exact same constraint that let it be built by the million in under 3 months. The weakness and the speed were never two separate things. They were the same design decision, looked at from two different angles. By the 3rd week of August 1942, the order was complete. 1 million pistols packed and ready sitting in crates at a factory that had built exactly one product before this and would go right back to it once the contract ended. On paper, the hardest part of this entire program, designing and mass-producing a lethal object simple enough for a total stranger to use correctly on the first try, was finished. Getting that million guns from a warehouse in Indiana into the hands of the people they were built for would turn out to be a completely different problem, and it's the one nobody in that factory could solve. The plan was simple. Fly over occupied Europe and drop 1 million of these from the sky, letting resistance networks in France, Belgium, and beyond scoop them out of hedgerows and turn every village into a place where an occupying soldier might not walk home. That plan never happened. Not at scale, not even close. And the reason it collapsed says more about this weapon than the gun itself ever could. But before we get to why it collapsed, go back to the specs for a second. 1 shot, 25 feet, no sights worth the name. Judged as a gun, it's a joke. Judged as a rumor, it's a nightmare. And the gap between those two verdicts is the entire point. Picture a garrison commander who finds 200 of these pistols hidden in barns across his sector. He doesn't feel safe. He feels worse, because now he knows the drop happened. He knows the number was in the thousands, and he has no way of knowing which 200 he actually found. Every pistol he never recovers keeps working silently, doing nothing but existing in someone's coat pocket. You don't need the gun to fire. You need the enemy to believe it might. That was the entire military logic behind spending a wartime factory's full output on something this crude. It wasn't a battlefield weapon competing with rifles and machine guns. It was a tool for making an occupying army afraid of its own streets, and fear, unlike bullets, doesn't run out, which is exactly why the plan needed airplanes. Lots of them. Getting 1 million pistols into occupied territory meant flying over enemy-held ground again and again, dropping crates where resistance networks could reach them before German patrols did. And here's where the project ran into a problem no engineer could fix, because it wasn't an engineering problem. General Eisenhower, weighing where the Allies' limited aircraft should actually go in 1942 and 1943, wasn't willing to hand over that flight capacity for a pistol with a 25-foot range. Bombers and transport planes were needed for bombing runs, for supply lines, for operations that moved the front. A mass air campaign built around handguns lost that argument before it started. The centerpiece of the entire program, Europe, blanketed in Liberators, quietly died in a scheduling decision, not a battle. Some of the plans survived in pieces. Shipments went to Greece, where resistance networks were already active against Axis occupation. Other crates went to Sweden, positioned for onward movement toward occupied Norway and beyond. But some crates to Greece and Sweden is a rounding error against a 1 million-unit production run built for an entire continent. The gap between what was manufactured and what actually reached Europe is the real story here. And almost nobody tells it because "we made 1 million and dropped most of them" is a better legend than "we made 1 million and most of them never left a warehouse." The program's second life came from the other side of the planet. General MacArthur, running the Pacific Theater, heard about the stockpile sitting unused and requested 50,000 units for operations against Japanese forces. Unlike the European plan, MacArthur's request actually moved. Pistols shipped toward the Philippines and into China, into a theater where clandestine, small-unit resistance operations were already the standard way of doing things, not a special addition to conventional war. The pistol built for occupied Paris ended up doing more of its real work 8,000 miles away, arming networks that Washington had barely considered when the design was first approved. By the time the war ended, what remained was an uncomfortable arithmetic problem sitting in military storage. Roughly 1 million pistols made, a fraction actually distributed, and no theater commander eager to have hundreds of thousands of untraceable, unmarked one-shot handguns floating around a post-war occupation zone. Guns you can't account for don't stop being a security problem just because the shooting stopped. So the military did what militaries do with an expensive idea that didn't pan out as planned. It buried it. Quietly, without ceremony, the surplus stock was written off and destroyed. Boxcar after boxcar of pistols that had been assembled at a rate of 1 every 6.6 seconds, dismantled or scrapped in a process that generated no headlines and left almost no paper trail behind it. A program built to arm millions ended with American soldiers standing over crates of their own weapons, shredding the very things a factory in Indiana had raced to build in 11 straight weeks. That should have been the end of it. A wartime idea, expensive to imagine, cheap to build, and ultimately too small in its real deployment to matter. Filed away and forgotten, the way most oddities from 1942 eventually were. Except not every one of those 1 million pistols made it into a scrap pile. And 2 decades later, on the other side of the world, in a war nobody expected to still need a $2 pistols philosophy, someone in Washington was about to ask the exact same question the Army had asked in 1942, and get a very different answer. Nobody in Washington woke up one day and decided to build a pistol for the resistance. It started with one man, in March of 1942, months before George Hyde ever touched a drafting table, a Polish military attaché, formally requesting American help arming resistance fighters back home. That request landed on the desk of the U.S. Army's Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, and within roughly 2 weeks, the newly formed Joint Psychological Warfare Committee had turned it into a fully worked plan of action, urgent enough to fast-track straight to production. This whole weapon exists because one foreign officer asked a hard question, and someone in Washington actually answered it in 14 days. That speed explains a lot about what happened next, including why the gun's own name kept changing under it. For most of 1942, this pistol didn't officially exist. It traveled under its cover story, flare projector caliber .45, right up until Axis intelligence worked out what the crates actually contained. Once the enemy knew, the disguise had no job left to do. So the committee's successor agency, the newly formed Office of Strategic Services, dropped the fiction entirely. In 1944, the OSS gave the weapon the name it's known by today, Liberator. Not a code name this time, a message. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable, though, because the actual delivery numbers don't match the scale of the legend. France, the country most people picture when they hear Liberator, received roughly 25,000 units through official channels, and not by the mass skydrop everyone imagines. And the largest shipments didn't go to Europe at all. They went east, into the Pacific and to China, the theaters almost nobody pictures when they hear the word. If you built your mental image of this weapon around occupied Paris, the real map of where it went looks almost nothing like that. And the shortfall in France wasn't only about aircraft. There was a second reason, harder to put in a logistics report, and it has a name: Reinhard Heydrich. In late May 1942, Czech resistance operatives attacked the senior Nazi official running occupied Czechoslovakia. He died of his wounds days later. The Nazi response wasn't restrained. Entire villages were wiped off the map in reprisal. Civilian populations executed collectively for the actions of a few. Word of that reprisal spread through Allied planning circles fast, and it left a mark on how comfortable anyone felt handing out assassination pistols to occupied populations who would bear the retaliation not the soldiers issuing the weapon. Arming Europe with something built for exactly one purpose, killing an occupier at point-blank range, stopped looking like pure strategy and started looking like a moral liability, with the bill landing on civilians who never got a vote in the decision. So what actually happened when a pistol reached someone's hands? This is the part where honesty matters more than a clean story. Nobody can tell you with real confidence how many FP-45s were ever fired at a living person. Not because it never happened, because resistance networks, by design, kept no records. A guerrilla in Luzon or partisan in Thrace wasn't filing an after-action report with a Japanese or German patrol closing in behind them. What survives instead is scattered, secondhand, and largely undocumented, which means the popular image of liberators cutting down occupiers across Europe rests on far thinner evidence than the legend suggests. That's not a failure of the story. It's the actual shape of it, and pretending otherwise would be the same kind of myth-making that built the millions over Europe version in the first place. What we do know is what a fighter actually held in their hands: a waxed cardboard box, 10 rounds of .45 ACP tucked inside, and a pistol that took roughly 10 seconds just to load, lifting the breech, seating a round, closing it again, before you'd even reach the point of aiming. 10 seconds is a long time to stand exposed next to an enemy soldier. In practice, that loading window was often the real test the weapon posed, not the shot itself. By the time the fighting stopped, the military faced its final decision on the stockpile, and the record here is more specific than everything got scrapped. Of the roughly 1 million pistols built in that 11-week sprint back in 1942, the majority were written off and destroyed, exactly as described. But not all of them. Roughly 383,000 were shipped out to active theaters of war over the following years. And for those, there is no surviving record of what happened once they left American hands. No return manifest, no accounting. Nearly 400,000 lethal, untraceable, unmarked pistols simply exit the paper trail. Guns don't just vanish, though. They end up in pockets, drawers, black markets, and the bottom of footlockers carried home by soldiers who decided a $2 souvenir was worth the risk. And 2 decades later, on the other side of the world, someone at the CIA would go looking for exactly this kind of weapon again, not knowing or not caring that the US government had already tried this once, built 1 million of them, and quietly lost track of nearly 400,000. By 1962, the US government had already destroyed almost every FP-45 Liberator it once owned, which made it awkward when someone at the CIA looked at the deepening situation in Vietnam and asked the same question the Army had asked 20 years earlier. What if we handed local fighters something that could kill one enemy soldier and let them walk away with his weapon? Same doctrine, same math, same bet on fear over firepower. Only this time, there wasn't a warehouse of leftover pistols to reach for. They'd have to build the whole thing again from nothing. The job landed on Russell J. Moore, Chief Engineer for the Special Firearms Division at American Machine and Foundry, a man who'd go on to design suppressors and mortar systems for the U.S. military, but who spent 1962 rebuilding a 20-year-old idea from scratch. What came out of that project was called the Deer Gun, and if you set it next to the Liberator, you can see the family resemblance immediately, even though almost nothing about it is the same object. Cast aluminum instead of stamped steel, 9mm instead of .45. No trigger guard at all, just a plastic clip over the firing mechanism to stop it from going off by accident. To load it, you unscrewed the barrel entirely, dropped a round in, screwed it back on, cocked a lever, and fired. The grip was hollow, just like the original, holding 3 spare rounds and a thin rod to punch out the spent casing. The same problem, solved the same way, 20 years and 1 war apart. It cost about $4 to make, barely more than the Liberator, adjusted for 2 decades of inflation, which tells you the underlying idea hadn't changed even slightly. Still built to be handed to a stranger who'd never fired a gun. Still built to die in the moment it succeeded. Still built to be denied, officially on paper, the second anyone asked whose it was. Some accounts even suggest the name wasn't deer gun by accident at all, but a mishearing of its real designation, DEAR, for denied area. Nobody who worked on the project ever fully confirmed which version is true. Even its name kept the family habit of hiding in plain sight. And then the exact same thing happened to it that happened to its predecessor. Not a design failure, a political one. By 1964, American involvement in Vietnam had stopped being the kind of quiet, deniable conflict this pistol was built for. U.S. forces were committing openly and at scale. A clandestine giveaway weapon designed for a shadow war made a lot less sense in a war that wasn't a shadow anymore. The project was shelved. Only around 1,000 deer guns were ever made. As far as the historical record shows, not one was ever issued in the field. The Liberator's successor never fired a shot either, killed, like its predecessor, by circumstances that had nothing to do with the gun itself, which leaves you with a strange kind of symmetry. 2 governments 2 decades apart arrived independently at the same conclusion, that a cheap, disposable single-shot pistol was worth building by the thousands. And both times, the war around the weapon changed shape faster than the weapon could be used. The idea never failed. It just kept running out of the specific conditions it needed to matter. What did survive in both cases was the object itself, and what it became once the war moved on says more about this pistol than anything it did during the war. Original FP-45 Liberators are now among the rarest handguns in American military history. Damaged, incomplete examples start around $1,500. Pristine ones still sitting in their original waxed cardboard shipping boxes with the pictogram manual intact have sold for close to $7,000. The deer gun is rarer still. One example, boxed with its instructions and ammunition, sold at auction for over $25,000, a price built almost entirely on how few were ever made and how quietly the whole project disappeared. Small workshops now build faithful reproductions of the original Liberator for collectors who want to hold the idea without hunting down a 70-year-old original. And of only 2 firearms in the entire collection at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, one is a Liberator, kept not because of what it did in combat, but because of what it represented to the people it was dropped for. If you've made it this far through an object's entire life story, from a Polish officer's request in 1942 to an auction house in the present day, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for, and there's another one of these waiting for you right now. Subscribe if you want the next one delivered the day it drops, because that's the real ending here, and it isn't about bullets. The FP-45 Liberator was fired, by any honest account, almost never. Most of the million built were destroyed, unused, by the same government that raced to build them in 11 weeks. And it still became one of the most recognizable, most mythologized, most collected pistols to come out of the entire war, sitting in museum cases, inspiring a second design 20 years later, selling for thousands of dollars to people who will likely never fire it either. The bullet was never the product. The rumor that it might be in someone's pocket was, and a rumor, unlike a pistol, never runs out of ammunition.